I had been gone for 2 years and 4 months, not in the way of someone who goes away and comes back changed, in the way of someone who goes away so that the people they love are not endangered by what they know, and who comes back when the danger has passed, and who finds on returning that the danger was not only external. I want to describe what the 2 years and 4 months were, because the description is part of the honest account, and because the reasons for the leaving are necessary to understanding what I found on returning. My name is Nikolai Brenner. I am 62 years old. I was born in Vienna in 1961, and I grew up in the 4th District with my twin brother Lucas and our mother Hannah and our father Ernst, who was a secondary school mathematics teacher and who died in 2008 of the specific illness that takes people too quickly, and that I was not able to be home for the final stage of because I was in the middle of something that could not be interrupted, and that I have never entirely forgiven myself for. I studied economics and law at the University of Vienna and spent 10 years in corporate finance at a bank in Vienna before leaving to found a consulting firm that specialized in the specific intersection of financial analysis and corporate restructuring that I had developed both the expertise and the reputation to practice. The consulting firm Brenner Strategy GmbH operated from 1997 to 2019. In those 22 years, it built the specific kind of reputation that professional services firms build when they do their work correctly over a long period in a market that is small enough to have a genuine reputation economy, which is to say everyone who mattered knew what we did and why we were worth engaging. The firm had at its peak 9 consultants and a client list drawn from mid-sized Austrian and German family businesses that needed the specific combination of financial precision and operational understanding that we provided. I sold the firm in 2019. The sale was to 2 of my senior consultants who had been with me for over a decade and who were ready for the responsibility, and the transaction was structured fairly, and the transition was managed correctly, and the firm continued under new ownership in the same direction it had always been headed. The sale produced a sum that was significant and that I have managed carefully since. The reason I sold was not retirement. The reason I sold was a specific situation that had developed in the last years of the firm's operation, which I will describe accurately, because accuracy is the standard I am trying to maintain. In 2017, one of the firm's significant clients was a family business in the Austrian food manufacturing sector that had been referred to us by a bank contact and that had presented at the outset as a straightforward restructuring engagement. The engagement became, over 18 months, something else as the full picture of the client's situation emerged through the analysis. The situation included certain transactions that were documentable and that a responsible consulting firm in possession of the documentation could not in good conscience ignore. Isabelle Arnaud, who was already my legal advisor at that point, had been clear about what my obligations were. I had fulfilled those obligations. The fulfillment had consequences for the client and for the people connected to the client, and those consequences had over time produced a specific threat to the people connected to me. I am being deliberately imprecise about the details of the 2017 situation because the legal proceedings it initiated are still active in their later stages, and because I have been advised by Isabelle Arnaud not to be specific in public about the specifics. What I can say is that the threat was real and was assessed as real by people whose professional judgment I trusted, and that the correct response to the threat was to reduce the exposure of the people I cared about by removing myself from their proximity. The most direct form of this removal was to leave Austria. I left in the spring of 2021. I told Lucas I was going abroad for a period on a project and that I would be in contact by phone, and that the arrangement for the house was as we had agreed. I told my mother I was going abroad for work. I told no one else anything specific. I spent the following 2 years and 4 months in 3 European countries. Working remotely on a limited number of consulting engagements, maintaining contact with Isabelle Arnaud about the legal situation, and waiting for the situation to resolve to the point where my return was safe. The situation resolved in September 2023. Isabelle called me in Amsterdam, where I had been for 4 months, and told me that the proceedings had reached their conclusion and that the threat profile had changed sufficiently to allow me to return. I told her I was returning in October. I arrived at the gate of the Nantal house on a Tuesday afternoon in October and stood there for 3 minutes before I rang the bell. And I stood at the gate for 3 minutes before I rang the bell. The house was mine. I had bought it in 2019, 4 years before I left, using the proceeds from the sale of my consulting firm. And I had put it in Lucas's name on the advice of my legal advisor, because the consulting work I was transitioning out of had the specific kind of professional exposure that made personal assets better held at a remove. Lucas had lived in it as the caretaker while I was away. We had agreed this arrangement explicitly, in a document that Maître Isabelle Arnaud had drafted in Vienna and that both of us had signed. I had not told Lucas I was coming back. The reason I had not told Lucas I was coming back was that I had told no one I was coming back except Isabelle Arnaud, and I had told Isabelle Arnaud because she was the person who would need to know in order to begin the process of reversing the arrangement. I had sent Isabelle a message in September from a hotel room in Amsterdam saying that I was returning in October and asking her to prepare the relevant documentation. She had replied with a message that I want to describe precisely because the message was not what I had expected. She said, "Nikolai, I need to speak to you before you arrive at the house. The situation has changed. Please call me before you go to Salzburg." I called her from Amsterdam that same evening. She told me what she knew, which was not everything, but which was sufficient. She said, "I do not want to tell you this on the phone." She said, "I want you to see it yourself." She said, "But I need to prepare you for the possibility that what you see will be different from what you expect." I said, "Tell me the shape of it." She said, "Your brother Lucas has been living in the house not as the caretaker, but as the owner." She said, "He has been operating the property as his primary residence and has been conducting himself in the local community as the property's outright owner." She said, "His wife Isabelle has been managing the household." She said, "Your mother Hannah has been in residence throughout." I said, "In what capacity?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is what I would like you to see for yourself." I arrived at the gate on a Tuesday in October, and I stood there for 3 minutes. The house was a large Salzburg property in the Nantal district, the kind of house that announces itself in the specific way of Austrian residential architecture from the late 19th century, with a facade of pale plaster and green shutters and a gate of wrought iron set between 2 stone pillars. It was a beautiful house. I had chosen it because it was a beautiful house and because my mother had grown up in a house of this character in the 4th district of Vienna, and I had wanted her last years, if they were spent in a house I provided, to have the specific quality of the world she remembered. My mother Hannah was 79 years old. She had lived her entire life in Vienna and in the surrounding areas, and she had the quality of someone from her generation of Viennese women, which is a quality of specific competence and specific grace and the specific stubbornness of someone who survived the second half of the 20th century with their dignity intact and who finds that the survival has produced a character that is not easily moved. I rang the bell. A woman I did not recognize came to the intercom. She said, "Yes." I said, "My name is Nikolai Brenner." She said, "We are not expecting visitors." I said, "No." I said I would like to speak with my brother Lucas. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lucas is not available." I said, "Tell him Nikolai is at the gate." There was a long silence. Then the gate opened. The path from the gate to the front door passes through a garden that I had designed with specific attention to what my mother would be able to maintain and enjoy as she aged, which meant level paths and raised beds and seating areas with good sun exposure and no steps. I had thought about her knees and her preference for roses and the specific quality of the Salzburg light in the mornings when it falls on the garden from the east. The garden had been my first design decision about the house and the one I had taken most seriously. The garden was in good condition. The roses had been properly maintained. The paths were clear. Someone had been looking after it with care. The front door opened before I reached it. Lucas was standing in the doorway. He was 64 years old, 2 years older than me, and we had the specific relationship of identical twins that is both more and less than people who have not experienced it imagine. We are different in the ways that shared genetics and divergent lives produce. Which is to say, we look the same in the rough sense and different in every way that matters if you have been looking carefully. He had our mother's narrow face, which we both have, and our father's height, which we both have, and an expression that I recognized from our childhood as the expression he wore when he had been caught doing something he had known he should not do, and who had been managing the situation rather than addressing it. He said, "Nikolai." I said, "Lucas." He said, "I thought you were coming in December." I said I was coming in December. I said I changed my plans. He said, "You should have told me." I said I should have told you. I said, "May I come in?" He stepped back from the doorway and I walked into my house. The interior had been changed, not dramatically, not in a way that destroyed the character of the house or that made it unrecognizable, but in the specific way that a house is changed when the person living in it is furnishing their own life rather than caring for someone else's property. There were pictures on the walls I did not recognize. There was furniture that was not the furniture I had left. There was a quality to the rooms of a space that has been inhabited for 4 years by people who have decided that it is theirs. I walked through the entry hall and into the kitchen. The woman from the intercom was in the kitchen. She was 41 years old, and she was the woman Lucas had married 6 years ago in a ceremony in Vienna that I had attended and that I had found in the way of weddings that you attend because you love one of the people in them and find the other opaque. Informative in the ways I had noted without yet having occasion to act on. Her name was Isabel, which created a specific confusion with my lawyer that I will acknowledge and set aside. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been anticipating something for a long time and who finds the arrival of the thing less dramatic than the anticipation. She said, "Nikolai, welcome." I said, "Isabel, thank you." I said, "Where is my mother?" She said, "Hannah is in the back." She said, "She will be finishing the kitchen." I said, "I am sorry." She said it again. I said, "Finishing the kitchen." She said, "Yes, the cleaning. She does the kitchen in the afternoons." I did not say anything more. I walked past Isabel and through the kitchen and out the back door into the service area of the house that connects to the utility room and the secondary staircase, and that I had designed as the functional core of the house, the part that makes the visible part possible. My mother was in the utility room. She was standing at the sink washing dishes. She was wearing a practical apron over her clothes, and she was washing the dishes from what appeared to have been a lunch occasion. The plates and glasses of 4 people with the specific careful attention of someone who has been taught to wash dishes correctly and who has been doing so for many years. She was 79 years old, and she had arthritis in her hands that I knew about from her letters and from our phone calls, and the hands holding the plate at the sink had the specific quality of hands that are managing pain while performing a task, the small extra concentration in the grip. I said, "Mama, Mama." She turned around. She looked at me for a moment. Her expression went through several things very quickly. Recognition. Then something I can only describe as the specific quality of a person who has been doing something they are ashamed of in front of someone they love and who has been found. Then the smile that I have known since I was an infant. The smile that she uses when she is trying to make the situation better than it is. She said, "Nikolai, you are back." I said, "Yes." I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "The dishes." She said it simply as if the question had a simple answer. I said, "Mama." She said, "I help. It is good to have something to do." I said, "You are not here to wash dishes. She said, I do not mind. I said, I mind. She said, Nikolai. She said my name in the specific register that mothers use when they are asking you to be calm, in the way that allows them to give you information without the information going to the place it should not go. I said, tell me. She told me. She told me in the utility room with the dishes still in the sink, in the plain, careful voice of someone who has been managing a situation and who has now decided that the management is finished. She told me that in the first year after I left, the arrangement had been as agreed, and that Lucas had behaved as the caretaker, and that she had had the room I had prepared for her, and the life I had intended. She told me that in the second year things had changed in the way that things change when a person decides that an arrangement is permanent rather than temporary. She told me that Isabel had become the manager of the household, and that the managing had extended to what my mother was expected to do in the household, and that what she was expected to do had expanded incrementally to include the dishes and the cleaning of the bathrooms and the preparation of certain meals, and that the expansion had been achieved through the specific mechanism of making each individual request reasonable and each cumulative requirement unreasonable in a way that was difficult to address directly. She said, I do not want you to be angry. I said, I am not angry. This was not entirely true. She said, Lucas is your brother. I said, I know. She said, he is not a bad man. He is weak. There is a difference. I said, yes. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I am going to address the situation. She said, how? I said, correctly. I called Isabel Arnaud from the utility room while my mother finished the dishes. Isabel Arnaud answered on the first ring. She said, you are in the house. I said, yes. She said, and you have seen. I said, yes. She said, I am ready. I said, begin. What begin meant was the following. Isabel Arnaud had been preparing at my instruction since September a legal restoration of the property to its intended ownership structure. The document that Lucas and I had signed in 2019 was a trust arrangement, not a transfer of ownership, and the specific provisions of that arrangement were clear about the conditions under which the property was held and the conditions under which the caretaker's position could be terminated. The conditions for termination were in the language of the document. The return of the beneficial owner or the failure of the caretaker to maintain the property in accordance with the stated purpose of the arrangement. The stated purpose of the arrangement was the care and maintenance of the property for the benefit of the beneficial owner's family, specifically including the beneficial owner's mother. The failure of this purpose was documented. The documentation was in Isabel Arnaud's possession. The restoration process could begin immediately. I stayed in the house that night. I slept in the room I had designed for myself, which Lucas and Isabel had been using as a guest room, and which still had the bed and the desk I had specified. Lucas and I had not had a significant conversation. I had told him at dinner that Isabel Arnaud would be in contact about the legal process. He had said, the house is mine. I said, the house is mine. Lucas, the document we both signed in 2019 is clear about this. He said, I have been maintaining it for 4 years. I said, you have been living in it for 4 years. There is a difference. Isabel had not said anything. She had looked at her wine glass. The legal process took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I stayed in the house in the specific quality of someone who is in the right place that has temporarily been made to feel like the wrong place, which is an uncomfortable quality, but a different quality from being in the wrong place. Lucas and Isabel departed for their apartment in Vienna, which they had maintained throughout the 4 years as a secondary residence on the 3rd day. They left without the specific conversation I would have preferred to have, which is the conversation in which the full account of what happened is given and acknowledged. This conversation did not occur. It may occur eventually. I am prepared to wait for it and to have it when it occurs and to bring to it the accuracy that it deserves. My mother moved back into her room. Her room in the house on the Nontal was exactly as I had designed it, facing east for the morning light, with the garden visible from the bed and from the chair where she liked to sit. The room had a small piano, a Bosendorfer upright that I had bought for her specifically, and a bookcase with the books she had always owned and that had travelled with her from Vienna. On the third day after Lucas and Isabel left, I heard the piano. She was playing something from Schubert, playing it slowly and with the specific care of hands that are working against pain, but that know the music from memory, and that can find it when the hands themselves are not fully cooperating. I stood in the hallway and listened. The autumn light was on the garden through the window at the end of the hall. The music was quiet and exact. I thought about the utility room and the dishes, and about the specific distance between the life I had built for her and the life she had been living, and about what the distance represented, and about what my responsibility for it was, and about what the weeks ahead required. The process completed in December. The property was formally in the correct legal position. Lucas received a modest financial settlement for the years of maintenance calculated by Isabel Arno's office at the rate of a professional caretaker for the Salzburg property market over the period in question. The settlement was fair. He accepted it through his lawyer without contact. I have been in the house for 3 months now. It is January, and the Salzburg winter has the quality, it always has the specific cold clarity of the Alps in January when the snow has settled, and the city has a quality of being entirely itself that it does not have in the tourist seasons. My mother is in her room with the piano and the garden and the morning light and the books. And she has the quality she has always had, which is the quality of someone who is where they should be and who knows it. I want to describe what happened between October and December in more detail, because the detail is the part that is most important and that is most often absent from accounts like this one. Lucas did not leave immediately when I told him about Isabel Arno's process. He stayed for 3 days, and during those 3 days we had the specific cohabitation of two people who have a significant unresolved matter between them and who are managing the space rather than addressing the matter. We ate breakfast in shifts. We said the necessary practical things. We did not have the conversation about what had happened. On the second evening he came to my study. I was working at the desk. He said, "Nikolai?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to understand that it was not intentional." I said, "Which part?" He said, "The." He stopped. He said, "Mama." I said, "The part where Mama was washing dishes." He said, "Yes." He said, "It was not what I intended." He said, "Isabel thought it was good for her to have tasks." I said, "Yes." I said, "I understand that was how it was presented." He said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to say something." I said, "Say it." He said, "I thought you were not coming back." He said it quickly. He said, "I thought the 2 years had become permanent." I said, "Why did you think that?" He said, "You stopped calling regularly." I said, "I called every month." He said, "Every month is not the same as before." I said, "Lucas." He said, "Yes." I said, "I bought this house for our mother." I said, "The document said caretaker." I said, "Not owner." He said, "I know." He said, "I know what the document said." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She should not have been cleaning." I said, "No." He said, "I should have stopped that." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry." I said nothing for a moment. I looked at my desk. I said, "Yes." I said, "I know you are." That was the conversation. It was not enough, and it was what was available. I accepted what was available and noted what was not. On the third day, he and Isabel left. Isabel did not speak to me directly before leaving. She was cordial in the formal way of someone who understands they are in the wrong position and who is managing the exit. I was equally cordial. We shook hands at the door. I thought about the dishes. I have 2 people I want to describe because their presence in the account is significant. The first is Thierry Lemaire, who is Isabel's brother. I mention him because he was the person whose presence at the house in October had expanded beyond what the situation required, and whose involvement in the household had been part of the mechanism by which Lucas had been progressively displaced from his own decision-making about the property. Thierry was 38 years old, and he was in the wine business in Vienna, and he had the specific quality of people who attach themselves to situations where the resources are not theirs and who find ways to make themselves useful enough to justify the attachment. He had been a regular guest at the house for 2 years and had been present at several occasions in a capacity that went beyond visiting and that included specific engagements with the property's finances that I found when I reviewed the accounts irregular. The review of the accounts was something Isabel Arnaud had been conducting simultaneously with the legal process. The review found that certain maintenance expenses had been billed to the property's management account at rates that were significantly above market rate for Salzburg, and that the contractors involved in several of these billings had addresses in Vienna that cross-referenced with Thierry Lemaire's business contacts. The amounts involved were not enormous. They were in the range of 40,000 euros over 2 years, but the pattern was specific and documentable. I passed the documentation to Isabel Arnaud's office. She said, "What do you want to do with this?" I said, "Document it completely. Keep it." I said, "I do not wish to pursue criminal proceedings." I said, "I wish to have the documentation in the correct place in case it becomes relevant." She said, "I understand." She said, "You know, this is a significant restraint." I said, "I know." She said, "Is there a reason?" I said, "The reason is that this is my brother's wife's brother." I said, "What happened to my mother is between me and my brother." I said, "Thierry's accounting irregularities are a separate matter, and they are documented, and they will stay documented." She said, "And if they become relevant again," I said, "then I will have them." The second person is Paul Krieger, who is my accountant and who I have worked with for 18 years. I mention Paul because it was Paul who, in a conversation in November while the legal process was ongoing, said something that I have been thinking about since. He said, "Nikolai Vol, I want to raise something with you." I said, "Yes." He said, "The settlement for Lucas." I said, "Yes." He said, "You are giving him the caretaker rate." I said, "Yes." He said, "That is fair?" I said, "Yes." He said, "It is also generous?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to make sure it is what you want." I said, "It is what I want." He said, "Some people in your position would give nothing." I said, "I know." He said, "Why are you giving something?" I held this for a moment. I said, "Because Lucas is my brother, and because the house was in his name for 4 years, and because he maintained it in the ways that matter and failed it in the ways that matter." I said, "The maintenance deserves payment. The failure deserves to be named and acknowledged and not repeated." He said, "You named it." I said, "Yes." He said, "Did he acknowledge it?" I said, "In part." He said, "Is that enough?" I said, "It is what is available." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Nikolai, one more thing." I said, "Yes." He said, "Your mother." I said, "Yes." He said, "How is she?" I said, "She is playing the piano." There was a silence. Then Paul said, "Good." He said, "That is good." And I could hear in his voice the specific quality of a person who understands what has been described by that sentence and who receives it correctly. My mother has been playing the piano every morning since November. She plays in the room with the east light, and the garden view plays the Schubert and the Brahms she has known since she was a girl in Vienna, plays it slowly and with great care and with the specific quality of someone returning to something they were separated from and who is in no hurry because the return itself is the thing. She has also resumed her practice of walking in the garden in the late morning. The garden paths are level, and the raised beds are at the right height, and the seating areas have the morning sun I designed for. On dry days, she walks for half an hour, and sits for half an hour, and looks at the Salzburg sky over the garden walls with the quality of someone who has lived through many things, and who has arrived at the specific peace of someone who is in the right place. I walked with her last Tuesday. She said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." She said, "You are staying this time." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am glad." She said it in the simple way she says things that she has been holding for a while and that she releases when the right moment arrives. I said I should have come sooner. She said, "You came when you could come." She said, "And you came the right way." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You did not come in anger. You came correctly." I said I was angry. She said, "I know." She said, "But you did not let the anger be the method." I said, "No." She said, "That is the right way." I said, "Yes." We walked for a while in the January garden. The roses were bare and the beds were covered, and the sky was the specific Salzburg blue that appears in January between the clouds, and that has a quality of cold clarity unlike any other sky I know. She said, "Tell me about where you were." I said, "Later." I said, "I will tell you everything later." She said, "I will hold you to that." I said, "I know you will." I am sitting in the study of the Nontal house on a January afternoon. The light is the east light of the morning, now shifted to the west for the afternoon falling on the desk where I have been working. The piano is quiet. My mother has had her walk and her lunch, and she is reading in her room. The garden is in its winter preparation, the correct garden preparing for the correct spring. Everything is in the right place. I want to say something about Lucas. I want to say it here because I have not said it to him directly, and because the account is not complete without it. Lucas is my brother. We grew up in the same room in the same apartment in the 4th district of Vienna, with the same parents and the same specific childhood of 2 boys who are the same and different in every possible way simultaneously. He was always the one who wanted the comfort first and the correctness second. And I was always the one who wanted the correctness first and the comfort as a consequence. These are not moral positions, they are preferences. The preferences produced the lives we have and the choices we made and the situation I returned to in October. I am not able to fully forgive him for the dishes. I want to be honest about this because the honest account requires it. I can account for the mechanism by which my mother came to be in that utility room, and I can account for Isabel's influence and Thierry's presence, and the specific way that incremental small requests become large requirements over time. I can account for all of that. But the account does not remove the image of my mother's hands on that plate in the sink, and it does not remove the fact that Lucas knew and did not address it. The not addressing is what I cannot fully account for except as the weakness my mother named, which is a different thing from malice, but not entirely separate from it. I am prepared to have the full conversation with Lucas when he is ready to have it. I expect that conversation to take place. I do not expect it to be easy. I expect it to produce something that is honest and therefore worth having. Until it does, the house is the house it was intended to be. My mother is in her room with the piano. The garden is in its winter preparation. The light is what it should be. The documents are in Isabel Arnaud's office. Everything is as it should be. That is the account. That is what there is to say. Nikolai Brenner, Salzburg, January. I want to describe more fully the 6 weeks between October and December, because those weeks are the substance of what this account is about, and because the account requires more than the outline I have given. The first week after Lucas and Isabel left was a week of specific restoration, not dramatic restoration. The practical restoration of a space to the conditions it was intended to have, which is a different kind of work from renovation or decoration, and that requires a different quality of attention. I went through each room and noted what had been changed and what required changing back and what could remain as it was. Most of the furniture changes could remain. The pictures on the walls were replaced with the ones I had stored in the utility room when Lucas and Isabel had put their own pictures up. The kitchen was reorganized to reflect how my mother used it. The garden was already in good condition and required only the maintenance that the season demanded. The room that required the most attention was my mother's room. During the years when Lucas and Isabel were conducting the household, my mother's room had been maintained as her room and not repurposed as something else, which was one of the things I found when I assessed the situation that I could count in Lucas's favor. The room was her room, her books were in it, her piano was in it, her photographs were on the walls, but the room had accumulated the quality of a space that is maintained rather than inhabited the quality of somewhere that is kept correct without being kept alive. Over the first week, she put things back the way she wanted them, which is to say, she moved the armchair from the position Isabel had put it in back to the position near the window where the morning light fell on it, and she rearranged the books on the bookcase in the order she has always kept them, which is not alphabetical and not by subject, but by the specific order that her reading history has produced over 70 years of reading the books in the positions they occupy because of when she read them and what they were to her at the time of the reading. She put a photograph of my father on the desk that had been in a drawer. She moved a lamp from one side of the room to the other. These were small things, and they were the most important things. By the end of the first week, the room had the quality of a room that is inhabited again rather than maintained. By the end of the second week, she had resumed the morning piano practice that I had been told by a neighbor she trusted and who had been sending me careful reports during the 2 years she had stopped doing in the second year of Lucas and Isabel's full occupation of the household. The neighbor's name was Frau Kreutzer. She was 73 years old, and she had lived on the street for 30 years, and she had the specific quality of the long-term Salzburg resident who knows the social landscape of their neighborhood with the precision of someone who has been paying attention for decades and who finds the attention its own reward. She had introduced herself to my mother in the first year of the arrangement, and they had become friends in the way that people of similar age and similar backgrounds and different lives become friends when they live near each other, the friendship based on the shared recognition of how things should be and how they sometimes are not. Frau Kreutzer had called me in the first year at a number my mother had given her for emergencies. She had called me not to describe an emergency, but to tell me that the situation was changing and that I should know. She had been calling me every 2 months since the second year, giving me reports in the specific careful language of someone who is describing what she observes without editorializing beyond what the observation requires. She had never said you should come back. She had described what she saw and let me draw the conclusions. I visited her in the second week of November. She was in her garden when I rang the bell doing the November garden work with the specific unhurried attention of someone who has been doing this in November for 30 years. She looked at me over the gate and said, "You came back." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She said, "Your mother has been playing the piano again." I said, "I know." She said, "She looks better." I said, "Yes." She said, "She is better." She invited me in for coffee. We sat in her kitchen, which was a different kitchen from the Nontal House kitchen, but that had the same quality of a kitchen that has been lived in correctly for a long time by someone who knows how to maintain a space. She told me what she had seen in the 2 years. She told me with accuracy and without excess. And when she had finished, she said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "Your brother." I said, "Yes." She said, "He is not." She stopped. She said, "He is not a bad man." I said, "I know." She said, "But his wife?" I said, "Yes." She said, "She is a different category." I said, "Yes." She said, "She was not unkind to your mother." She said, "It was more." She thought about it. She said, "She was indifferent." She said, "And indifference can be its own cruelty when it is applied to an old woman in her last years." I said, "Yes." She said, "I wanted you to know that." I said, "Thank you for telling me." I called Lucas in November, 2 weeks after he had returned to Vienna. He answered after several rings. His voice had the quality of someone who has been expecting a call and who has been preparing for it, and who finds, when it arrives, that the preparation was insufficient for the actual conversation. I said, "Lucas." He said, "Nikolai." I said, "I want to have a conversation with you." He said, "Yes." I said, "Not about the legal process. That is Isabel Arnaud's matter, and it is proceeding correctly." I said, "I want to have a conversation about Mama." He said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know what you are going to say." I said, "Then you can tell me." He was quiet for a moment. He said that she should not have been cleaning. I said that she should not have been cleaning. I said, That at 79 years old with arthritis in her hands, she was washing the dishes of the people living in her house. He said, "The house is." He stopped. He said, "Was." He said, "Was in my name." I said, "It was in your name as caretaker of a trust I established for our mother." I said, "Those are different things." He said, "I know." He said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to say this correctly." He said Isabel thought it was good for Mama to have tasks. She said older people needed purpose. I said Lucas. He said yes. I said there is a difference between purpose and service. There is a difference between your mother having the garden she wanted and your mother washing your dinner plates. He said I should have. He stopped. I said yes. He said I should have stopped it. I said yes. He said, "Why didn't I?" He was asking himself rather than me. I waited. He said, "I do not know." He said, "I told myself it was fine, and then I kept telling myself it was fine." I said, "That is the mechanism." He said, "What mechanism?" I said, "The mechanism by which small things become large things." I said, each individual thing was manageable, and the accumulated thing was not, and the accumulated thing happened because no single thing triggered the necessary response. He said, "That is a very clinical way to describe it." I said, "Yes." I said, "It is also accurate." He said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." He said, "Will you forgive me?" I held this for a long time. I said, "I think forgiveness is a process rather than a decision." I said, "I am in the process." He said, "Is that enough for now?" I said, "For now, yes." The call lasted 47 minutes. It was not the full conversation. It was the beginning of the conversation that will need to happen, and that I am prepared to have when Lucas is ready to have it completely. The beginning was honest, and the honesty is what matters in a beginning. The house in January has the quality that I designed it to have in January, which is the quality of a house that is warm against the Austrian winter and that has the specific efficiency of a well-built structure that maintains its temperature without excessive cost and that has the particular quality of late 19th century Salzburg construction, which is that the walls are thick enough to be honest about their purpose and that the rooms are the right size for the lives they were designed for. I have been in the study every morning from 7 to 12 working on the project I began in Amsterdam and that I am continuing here. The project is a book which is not something I expected to be writing and which has the quality of something that presents itself as necessary rather than as a choice. The book is about the specific relationship between financial analysis and the human situations that financial analysis describes the way that numbers contain people and the way that people contain numbers and the gap between those two containments. That is where most of the interesting work happens. This is not a technical book in the financial sense. It is a professional account with philosophical edges, and I am finding it more difficult and more satisfying than anything I have attempted in the professional domain. My mother has been reading the pages I show her. She reads them with the specific quality of someone who has spent her life around academics and professionals and who has developed over 70 years of engagement with ideas and people, a quality of reading that is both technically competent and personally engaged. She says, "This part is too technical." I say, "Where?" She shows me. She is right. She says, "This part is too personal." I say, "Where?" She shows me. She is right again. I have been revising accordingly. The days have the quality that good days have when the structure is correct and the work is real, and the people present are the right people. My mother has her walks and her piano and her afternoons with her books. I have the study and the book and the mornings. We have lunch together and dinner together and the specific domestic life of two people who have the right relationship to each other and who find the daily life of that relationship sufficient. I want to say something about Isabel Arnaud that I have not said in this account. She is 49 years old, and she has been my legal advisor for 12 years, and she has, in those 12 years, handled my professional and personal legal matters with the specific quality of precision and care and genuine engagement that constitutes in a legal advisor the highest professional standard. She has never told me what to decide. She has always told me what my options were and what their implications were, and she has then waited for me to decide, and she has implemented whatever I decided with the same quality of care, regardless of whether she agreed with it. In October, when I called her from Amsterdam, and she told me to see the situation myself before she described it further, she was doing something specific and deliberate. She was giving me the option of seeing my mother in the utility room rather than being told about it. She knew the difference between the two ways of receiving information, and she knew which one was more likely to produce the response that the situation required, rather than the response that my feelings about the situation would produce. She was right to do it. The seeing was different from the telling. The seeing was what produced the quality of response that I brought to the 6 weeks. I called her in January to tell her the house was settled and that the process was complete. She said, "Good." She said, "Nikolai, I want to say something." I said, "Yes." She said, "You handled this correctly." She said, "I have seen situations like this handled in other ways." She said, "The way you handled it was the right way." I said, "The settlement for Lucas was fair," she said. "It was fair and it was generous and it communicated what it needed to communicate without saying more than needed to be said." I said, "Yes." She said, "The theory documentation is in the file." I said, "Yes." She said, "If it becomes relevant." I said, "If it becomes relevant." She said, "And Isabel." I said, "Isabel will live with the understanding that the documentation exists. That is sufficient." She said, "Yes, that is usually sufficient." I walked in the garden last Saturday with my mother. It was a clear January day with the specific quality of clarity that Salzburg has in January, when the sky is blue and the snow is on the Untersberg and the city is going about its business with the particular efficiency of a place that is accustomed to winter and that has organized itself accordingly. We walked the level paths and sat in the seating area that faces east, and my mother talked about Vienna and about my father and about the winter we spent in Innsbruck when Lucas and I were 9 years old, and there was a specific snowstorm that we found magical and our father found inconvenient and that she had found beautiful. She told this story with the clarity and the detail of someone who is fully present in the memory, not in the way that the past is sometimes confused with the present, but in the way that the past is available with its original quality when the person remembering is at peace. She said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." She said, "You are not going again." It was not a question. I said, "No, I am not going again." She said, "I want to say something about when you were away." I said, "Say it." She said, "I was not unhappy." I said, "I know you were not unhappy." She said, "I was not in danger." I said, "I know." She said, "But I was." She stopped. She said, "I was smaller." I said, "Yes." She said, "I felt smaller." She said, "Not because of anything terrible that was done." She said, "Because of the accumulation of small things that make a person feel that they are in someone else's house rather than in their own." I said, "Yes." She said, "I did not understand that was happening until it had been happening for a long time." She said, "That is the mechanism you described." I said, "Yes." She said, "I should have called you sooner." I said, "Mama." She said, "Yes." I said, "You should not have had to call me." I said, "That is the thing." She looked at the garden. She said, "No." She said, "That is right." We sat in the garden for a while longer. The Untersberg was visible over the garden wall to the south, the specific mountain that has been visible from Salzburg since before there was a Salzburg, the mountain that does not change while everything else changes. My mother looked at it with the expression she uses when she is thinking about something she has been thinking about for a long time and is now close to the thought. She said, "You know what I think about when I see the mountain? I said, "Tell me." She said, "I think about what has been seen from this place." I said, "Yes." She said, "Everything that has happened in this city, everything that has changed." She said, "And the mountain has been there for all of it." She said, "That is what endures." I said, "Yes." She said, "The things that are built for the right reasons endure." She said, "The things that are taken for the wrong reasons do not." She said, "Eventually the mountain is still there and the other things are not." I said, "Yes." She said, "This house was built for the right reasons." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is why we are still in it." We walked back inside for lunch. The kitchen was warm and the food was ready, and the piano was visible through the doorway to the room where it lives. The house was the house I built for the right reasons. Everything was as it should be. I have been thinking about the twins question because it is the question that this account raises and that I want to address directly. The question is this: how does a person who grew up sharing everything with another person who shared a room and a face and a childhood and a mother and a city arrive at the place where that other person allowed their shared mother to wash dishes for strangers in a house I built for her? The answer I have is this: Lucas and I are the same and different in the way of all twins, which is completely. We shared everything and we came out different. His preference for comfort over correctness is not a defect. It is a preference that has organized a life that is in many ways good and that would have continued to be good if it had not been directed. Through Isabel's management and Thierry's presence towards the specific outcome that I found in October, the preference did not make him bad, it made him susceptible. The susceptibility in the wrong conditions produced a consequence that he has acknowledged as wrong and that he cannot undo. I cannot undo it either. I can only be here now in the house with my mother and be here correctly for the years that remain. That is what I am doing. That is what I intend to continue doing. Nikolai Brenner, Salzburg, January. The mountain is still there. I want to add something about the Salzburg house itself, because the house is not simply a property in this account, but the thing the account is about, and the description of what it is and what it was designed to be is part of the honest telling. I bought the house in 2019 in the spring, after the sale of the firm had completed, and before I had fully understood what the situation with the 2017 client would require. I bought it in the specific way of someone who has accumulated the means to act on a long-held intention and who finds, when the means are available, that the intention is still there and is correct. The intention had been present since my father died in 2008. The intention was that my mother should have a house that was designed for her rather than a house that she accommodated herself to. The difference is specific and important. A house designed for a person anticipates the person's needs and organizes the space around those needs. And a house that a person accommodates themselves to is one in which the person must manage the gap between what the space is and what the person requires. My mother had spent her adult life in apartments that were adequate. I wanted her last years to be in a house that was precisely right. The non-Tal house was found through an estate agent who had been recommended by Paul Krieger. Paul said the agent specialized in older Salzburg properties that required understanding of the specific quality of the architecture rather than simply the measurement of the square footage. He was right. The agent showed me 4 properties over 2 days, and the 4th was the one, which I knew within 10 minutes of the first walkthrough, the knowing that comes from years of analyzing how spaces function and recognizing when a space has the potential to function correctly. The purchase was followed by a renovation of approximately 7 months. I spent those months with an architect named Christina Berger, who worked in Salzburg and who had the quality I required, which was the quality of someone who listened to what was needed and designed for the need rather than for the appearance of the solution. The key design brief was specific. A house for a woman in her 70s with arthritis and specific preferences for light and for garden access and for the piano and for the morning reading and for all the particular habits that a person accumulates over a long life and that constitute, in aggregate, who that person is in their daily life. Christina designed the level paths and the raised beds and the east-facing bedroom and the seating areas with the specific sun exposure I described. She designed the kitchen to be at the right height for a woman who would be spending time at the kitchen counter and who had the specific physical stature my mother has. She designed the bathroom with the specific supports and the specific proportions that make a bathroom usable for someone whose mobility is not what it once was, but who is not yet at the stage of requiring institutional adaptations. The piano was accommodated in the room that had the right acoustics and the right morning light, and that would allow the playing to be heard through the house in the way that I had grown up hearing my mother play the specific domestic music of a piano in another room. That is one of the pleasures of a childhood that I associate with home. I furnished the house in the autumn of 2019 with Christina's guidance and with Paul Krieger's patient management of the budget that I found repeatedly insufficient for my intentions and that Paul repeatedly adjusted upward with the specific quality of someone who understands that certain expenditures are not excessive in the context of what they are for, he said. At one point in the furnishing process, when I had specified a particular sofa that was beyond the original estimate, Nikolai, is this the sofa, or is this something else? I said, "It is the sofa your mother will sit in for the rest of her life." He said, "Then it is appropriate." My mother moved into the house in November 2019. She came from Vienna with her books and her piano and her photographs and the specific objects that constitute the portable museum of a life well lived in one city for most of 7 decades. She moved in over 2 days, and by the end of the second day, the house had the quality I had been working towards since I first saw it in the spring. The quality of a space inhabited by the person it was built for. She called me the evening of the second day from the east-facing bedroom. She said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." She said, "The light in the morning." She said, "It is exactly right." I said, "Good." She said, "How did you know?" I said, "I know where the sun rises." She said, "Yes." She said, "You always have." She said, "Your father would say you were the practical one." I said, "He said that about both of us at different times." She said, "He was more right about you." 2 years later, I left. The house that I had designed for her and that she had been in for 2 years, and that had settled into the exactly right quality that well-built things settle into when the person they were built for has been living in them correctly. I left it in Lucas's name and went abroad and came back to find her in the utility room. I want to say this clearly because I have been careful throughout this account to describe the mechanism by which things happened and to avoid the simpler narrative of the bad actor and the victim. The simpler narrative is available and it contains real elements. Isabel directed the household in a direction that was wrong. Lucas did not stop it. Thierry was opportunistic in ways that were documented. These things happened and they are real. What is also real is this. I left a 77-year-old woman in a house with people I had not known well enough to trust fully, and I left for reasons that were genuine and that I would make the same choice about again, and the leaving produced consequences I did not anticipate. The responsibility for those consequences is distributed. The distribution is complex. I have tried to account for the distribution honestly throughout this account. What I know sitting in the study in January with the Untersberg visible over the garden wall is that I am here now. The being here now is not nothing. The being here correctly is the thing that matters from here forward. I intend to be here correctly. Christina Berger, the architect, called me in December after the legal process had completed. She had heard from a mutual contact that I was back in the house, and she called to say she was glad. She said, "Nikolai, the house is in good condition." I said, "Yes, it is." She said, "I drove past it in October before you came back." She said, "I could see the garden from the road and it was well maintained." I said yes, Lucas kept the garden correctly. She said the house was maintained. I said yes. She said, but it did not look like itself. I said, what do you mean? She said, a house designed for a specific person has a quality when the person is in it that it does not have when the person is not in it. She said I drove past in October and the house did not have its quality. I said, and now? She said I drove past in December after the process completed. She said the quality was back. I said yes. She said she is playing the piano. I said yes. She said good. She said the house is for the piano. She said the house is for the piano. This is the truest thing that has been said about the house, and it is what I would say if I were asked to describe in one sentence what the house was designed to do. The house is for the piano and the person who plays it, and the morning light and the garden and the books and the life that those things constitute when they are in the right place with the right person. They are in the right place with the right person. That is the full account. Nikolai Brenner, Salzburg. The mountain is still there. The house is for the piano. Everything is correct. I want to describe one more thing, which is the conversation I had with Frau Kreutzer in December after the legal process had completed and after the house had returned to its correct state. I went to see her on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of December afternoon in Salzburg, when the sky is low and grey and the snow on the Untersberg has come closer to the city and the air has the specific cold that Austrian December has when it has decided to be winter seriously. She was in her kitchen again and again she made coffee. And we sat at her kitchen table with the coffee and the December light through the window and talked for 2 hours. She told me things she had not told me in November. She told me that in the spring of 2022, approximately 1 year after I had left, she had tried to speak to Lucas about what she was observing with my mother. She had knocked on the gate on a Saturday morning and asked to speak with him, and he had come out to the garden and she had told him carefully and specifically what she had seen and what she thought it meant. He had listened, and he had said he would address it, and she had left believing him. Nothing had changed. She said, I want you to know I tried. I said, I know you tried. I said, you called me. She said, I called you 2 months later when nothing had changed. She said, I described what I saw, and I let you decide what to do with it. I said, you were right to do that. She said, was I? She said it in the way of someone who has been questioning their own judgment about a situation for a long time and who wants a direct answer. I said, you were right. I said, you gave me the information accurately and consistently, and you let me act on it as I saw fit. She said, I sometimes thought I should have been more direct. I said, you were direct. She said, with you, yes. She said, but perhaps with Lucas, perhaps with more force. I said, Frau Kreutzer. She said, yes. I said, Lucas is my brother and that conversation was mine to have. I said, you provided the information that made it possible for me to have it. I said, that is the right amount. She said, I am glad you think so. I said, I do think so. She said, how is she? I said, she is playing the piano. She said, every morning. I said, every morning. She looked out the window. The December light was going. She said, when she stopped playing, that was when I knew it was serious. She said, your mother has played piano every morning of her life since she was 7 years old. When a person stops doing the thing they have always done, the thing that is them in some essential way, that is when you know something is wrong. I said, yes. She said, and now it is right. I said, yes. She said, good. She said, she came to the gate last week to bring me something. She said strudel. She had made apple strudel and she brought it over. I said, she has been cooking again. She said she brought it herself. She said, she walked to the gate herself. She said, I made this for you. Gertrude, I want you to know I am home. I said, yes. She said, that is the right word. She said, home. I thanked her for the 2 years of calls. And she said it was nothing, and I said it was not nothing, and she said she hoped I was staying, and I said I was staying, and she said good, and I went back to the house. I want to include something that happened in the week before Christmas. My mother asked me to help her write letters. This is something she has done for many years, the writing of Christmas letters to people she has known for a long time, people from Vienna and from her earlier life, and from the various phases of the life she has lived. And the letters are not long letters, but they are specific letters, the kind of letters that contain 1 or 2 sentences that the recipient has been waiting to receive, because they contain the exact acknowledgement of what has passed between the writer and the reader, that the passing of the years has been accumulating. She wrote 7 letters that week. She told me what she wanted to say, and I wrote first drafts, and she revised them. And the revision process produced, as it always does, something better than either the first draft or the original intention. The way that the best human expressions come from the gap between what was intended and what the process of expression produces. One of the letters was to Lucas. She had not been in contact with Lucas since October. She had not asked me about the legal process while it was ongoing, and I had not offered information except when she asked directly, and she had asked directly twice, once about the settlement and once about the documentation, and I had answered both questions accurately, and she had received the answers and put them in the correct place. The letter to Lucas was short. She said, "I want to say 3 things." I said, "Tell me." She said, "First, that I love him." I said, "Yes." She said, "Second, that I am in my house and I am well." I said, "Yes." She said, "Third," she stopped. She thought about it for a moment. She said, "Third, that what happened was not something I blame him for, in the way that you blame someone for a deliberate act." She said, "I think it happened because he could not see it clearly." She said, "I want him to know that I can see it clearly, and that what I see is still my brother's son, and that this matters more than what went wrong." I said, "That is 3 things." She said, "Can you write that correctly?" I said, "Yes." I wrote it correctly. She revised 2 sentences. The letter was sent. Lucas called me the day after Christmas. He said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." He said, "Mama's letter." I said, "Yes." He said, "I." He stopped. He said, "I have been reading it every day since it arrived." He said, "I am going to keep reading it until I understand what I need to understand." I said, "That is the right thing to do with a letter like that." He said, "Nikolai." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you think she will see me?" I said, "I think when you are ready to see her correctly, she will want to see you." He said, "When will that be?" I said, "I do not know." I said, "I think you will know." He said, "Yes." He said, "I hope so." He said, "Nikolai, I want to say." He stopped. He said, "I am trying." I said, "I know." I said, "That is enough for now." That was the last time I spoke to him. It is January. He is in Vienna. My mother is in Salzburg with her piano and her garden and her morning light. The letters were sent. The conversations are in progress. Everything that can be correct right now is correct. The book is coming along. The Untersberg is still there. The house is for the piano. Nikolai Brenner, Salzburg, January. That is everything. The piano this morning was Brahms. The intermezzo in A Major, the Opus 118 No. 2, which is one of the pieces she plays when she is in a particular quality of mood that I learned to identify as a child, and that I have always associated with the specific quality of a person who is entirely present in the thing they are doing. The Brahms at this specific Bosendorfer in this specific room with this specific east light is what the house was for. This is what I built. This is what is here. That is enough. That is everything there is to say. Nikolai Brenner, Salzburg, January. The mountain is still there. I sat in the study until the Brahms finished. Then I heard the silence that follows a piece of music when it has been played well in a room that is the right size for it. Then I heard her begin again the same piece from the beginning, because she plays some pieces twice. When she is in this particular mood, plays them a second time to see if the first was correct. It was correct. The second time confirmed it. I went back to the book. Everything is as it should be. The Bosendorfer in the east-facing room. The Untersberg visible over the garden wall. Hannah playing Brahms in January. Nikolai writing at the desk. 2 people in the right place for the right reasons. This is the full account. This is what there is to say. I want to note one final practical thing, which is about the documentation that Isabel Arnaud holds. regarding Thierry Lemaire's accounting irregularities. I decided in November not to pursue criminal proceedings. I want to say why I made that decision because the reasons are part of the honest account. The amounts involved were €40,000 over 2 years. The documentation is specific and the irregularities are clear. A criminal proceeding would be possible and would likely succeed. I chose not to pursue it because Thierry Lemaire is Isabelle's brother and Isabelle is Lucas's wife, and pursuing Thierry would have made the conversation I need to have with Lucas impossible for years. I chose the conversation over the prosecution. I kept the documentation. If Thierry creates another situation in the future, in any context, the documentation exists and can be used. This is the correct calibration. The €40,000 matter. The relationship with my brother matters more. The documentation exists. That is sufficient. Nikolai Brenner, Salzburg, January. The account is complete.